Cameron here, 27 years old, and 2 years ago, I walked out of the most humiliating moment of my academic life. Professor Harrison Walsh had just told an entire classroom that I'd never make it in engineering, that my background was inadequate, and that I should reconsider whether graduate school was right for someone like me. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't even say a word. I just packed up my stuff and left. What Walsh didn't know was that his public dismissal had just lit a fire that would burn down every assumption he'd made about my capabilities. I'd always been fascinated by renewable energy systems and environmental engineering, but my path to studying it hadn't been traditional. I grew up in a small industrial town where most people worked in manufacturing or agriculture. My family didn't have college money, so I'd spent 6 years after high school working construction jobs and saving every penny I could toward eventually pursuing higher education. During those working years, I taught myself programming, studied engineering concepts online, and even designed a small solar installation for our family's workshop. I wasn't just dreaming about renewable energy, I was building real systems and learning through hands-on experience. When I finally had enough money saved to pursue a master's degree in environmental engineering, I felt ready to contribute meaningful perspectives to academic discussions. The program at State University had an excellent reputation for renewable energy research, and I'd been accepted based on my portfolio of self-directed projects and my demonstrated passion for sustainable technology. I knew I'd be competing with students who had traditional undergraduate engineering degrees, but I was confident that my practical experience would complement their theoretical knowledge. That's where I met Professor Harrison Walsh, the department's most respected faculty member and the person who would become my thesis advisor. Walsh had been at the university for 23 years, had published extensively on photovoltaic systems, and was considered one of the leading authorities on renewable energy integration. On paper, he was exactly the mentor I'd hoped to work with. But Walsh had very specific ideas about who belonged in graduate engineering programs and what constituted legitimate preparation for advanced study. From our first meeting, he made it clear that he viewed my background as insufficient and my admission to the program as questionable. He'd make comments about how academic rigor was different from tinkering in garages and how real engineering required mathematical foundations that couldn't be learned through YouTube videos. During my first semester, Walsh taught the core Renewable Energy Systems course that all students in our concentration were required to take. The class covered advanced topics like grid integration modeling, power electronics design, and economic optimization of renewable installations. I was excited to finally study these concepts in depth and contribute insights from my practical experience. But Walsh seemed determined to prove that students without traditional backgrounds didn't belong in his classroom. He'd call on me with increasingly difficult questions, not to encourage learning, but to demonstrate the gaps in my formal education. When I'd offer answers based on real-world experience, he'd dismiss them as anecdotal rather than scientific. When I'd ask questions about practical implementation challenges, he'd suggest that I focus on understanding theory before worrying about application. The other students began to notice Walsh's targeting, and some started avoiding association with me to protect their own standing in the program. A few were sympathetic, but most seemed to accept Walsh's assessment that I was struggling to keep up with the academic demands of graduate study. The situation reached a breaking point during our midterm presentations. Each student had to present a proposal for improving renewable energy adoption in a specific sector. I'd chosen to focus on distributed solar installations for small manufacturing businesses, drawing on my construction experience to identify practical barriers that theoretical models often overlooked. My presentation included detailed cost analyses, implementation timelines, and solutions for common installation challenges that I'd encountered while working on actual projects. I thought I'd done well connecting academic research with real-world application, demonstrating exactly the kind of practical perspective that my background could contribute to engineering discussions. Walsh's response was immediate and devastating. He said my presentation showed exactly why practical experience without rigorous academic training was insufficient for graduate-level work. He criticized my methodology, questioned my data sources, and suggested that my conclusions were based more on anecdotal observations than scientific analysis. But he wasn't finished. Walsh told the class that while hands-on experience had value, graduate engineering programs required students who could think systematically about complex problems rather than relying on trial-and-error approaches. He said some students came to graduate school thinking their work experience made them ready for advanced study, but that academic engineering demanded a level of theoretical sophistication that couldn't be developed outside formal educational settings. Then he delivered the line that would change everything between us. Looking directly at me, Walsh said that students who couldn't distinguish between practical tinkering and rigorous engineering analysis would struggle not just in graduate school, but in any career requiring genuine technical expertise. He suggested that I might want to reconsider whether graduate study was the right path for someone with my background and aptitude. The classroom was silent. Every student was looking at me, waiting to see how I'd respond to being publicly humiliated by the department's most influential professor. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger, but I also felt something else, a cold determination that Walsh had just made the biggest mistake of his academic career. I closed my notebook, gathered my materials, and walked out of that classroom without saying a word. I didn't defend myself, argue with Walsh's assessment, or try to salvage my standing in front of my classmates. I just left, knowing that words weren't going to change his opinion about my capabilities or worthiness. But I also left with a plan that would prove Walsh wrong in ways he couldn't imagine. The weeks following that humiliating presentation were some of the most challenging of my life. Walsh's public dismissal of my capabilities had created a reputation problem that extended beyond his classroom. Other faculty members began treating me with barely concealed skepticism, clearly having heard about my academic struggles from their colleague. Fellow students avoided collaborating with me on projects, afraid that association with Walsh's designated failure would hurt their own prospects. But instead of being discouraged, I felt energized by the challenge Walsh had presented. He'd essentially claimed that practical experience was inferior to academic training, and that students like me couldn't succeed in rigorous engineering environments. I was going to prove him wrong, but not through arguments or appeals to fairness. I was going to demonstrate my capabilities in ways that made his assessment look foolish. I started by diving deeper into the renewable energy research than any of my classmates were doing. While they focused on meeting course requirements and impressing professors, I began working on an independent project that would showcase exactly the kind of systematic thinking Walsh claimed I lacked. I was going to design and build a renewable energy system that solved real problems while demonstrating rigorous engineering analysis. The project I chose was ambitious but perfectly suited to my background. I wanted to create a modular solar microgrid system that could be rapidly deployed for disaster relief and remote community electrification. The system would need to be transportable, scalable, and robust enough to operate in challenging environments without specialized maintenance support. The engineering challenges were substantial. I needed to optimize power generation and storage for varying load profiles, design control systems that could operate autonomously, and create modular components that could be configured for different applications. Most importantly, I needed to document every design decision with the kind of rigorous analysis and mathematical modeling that Walsh claimed I couldn't perform. I spent my winter break working 16-hour days on system design, component selection, and performance modeling. I used advanced simulation software to optimize configurations, perform detailed economic analyses of different deployment scenarios, and created comprehensive technical documentation that met the highest standards of engineering practice. But I wasn't just working in isolation. I reached out to industry contacts from my construction years and connected with humanitarian organizations that might benefit from portable electrification solutions. I wanted to ensure that my academic project addressed genuine real-world needs rather than being purely theoretical. By the start of spring semester, I had a complete system design and had identified a nonprofit organization willing to field test my prototype for their disaster response operations. More importantly, I'd applied for and received a substantial grant from the Department of Energy to fund the construction and testing of my microgrid system. The grant application process had been rigorous and competitive, requiring detailed technical proposals, budget justifications, and letters of support from academic and industry partners. The fact that my proposal had been selected for funding meant that experts outside the university had evaluated my work and found it worthy of significant investment. When I submitted my grant award notification to the graduate program office as required by university policy, the response was immediate and revealing. The department chair called me in for a meeting to discuss my project and understand how I'd managed to secure such competitive funding as a first-year graduate student. During that meeting, I learned something that put Walsh's behavior in a new context. The department chair mentioned that Walsh had been struggling to secure research funding for his own projects over the past few years, and that several of his recent grant proposals had been rejected for lacking practical relevance or industry connections. The irony was perfect. Walsh had been criticizing me for prioritizing practical application over theoretical rigor, but his own career was suffering because funding agencies wanted to see real-world impact rather than purely academic research. My ability to connect engineering analysis with practical implementation was exactly what modern research sponsors were looking for. Armed with this information and my successful grant application, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my graduate education. Instead of continuing to endure Walsh's hostility and work within a program where my advisor had publicly questioned my competence, I requested permission to transfer to a different research group and work with a professor who valued applied engineering research. The transfer was approved quickly, partly because my new advisor was excited about the grant funding I'd bring to his lab, and partly because the department administration recognized that my project aligned better with the university's strategic goals for renewable energy research. My new advisor, Professor Chen, had a completely different approach to mentoring graduate students. Instead of trying to prove their inadequacy, she focused on helping them develop their strengths and contribute meaningfully to important research problems. She was impressed by my technical work and excited about the practical applications of my microgrid project. Under Chen's guidance, I refined my system design and began the construction phase of my project. The work was challenging but rewarding, combining advanced engineering analysis with hands-on problem solving in exactly the way I'd hoped graduate school would allow. Meanwhile, Walsh continued teaching his courses and supervising other students, apparently unaware that the student he dismissed as academically inadequate had just received major federal funding for innovative research that addressed exactly the kind of challenges he claimed required theoretical sophistication. But I wasn't satisfied with simply succeeding despite Walsh's predictions. I wanted to create a moment where his assessment of my capabilities would be publicly revealed as completely wrong. I wanted him to understand that practical experience combined with rigorous analysis could produce results that purely academic approaches couldn't achieve. The opportunity for that demonstration was coming sooner than I expected. The opportunity I'd been waiting for arrived in the form of the annual Renewable Energy Symposium, a prestigious conference where our university showcased its most innovative research to industry leaders, government officials, and academic peers. The symposium was competitive. Only the most promising projects were selected for presentation, and being chosen was considered a major honor for graduate students. I submitted my microgrid project for consideration, knowing that Walsh would be on the selection committee and would have the opportunity to review my work. The proposal I submitted was comprehensive and technically rigorous, documenting not just my system design but also the federal funding I'd received and the field testing partnerships I'd established. When the acceptance notifications were sent out, my project was selected as one of only 12 presentations for the symposium. More importantly, I was chosen to give the opening presentation, highlighting my research as an example of the kind of innovative, practical engineering that the university wanted to promote. The symposium was scheduled for late spring, giving me several months to finalize my prototype and prepare a presentation that would demonstrate exactly the kind of systematic thinking and technical expertise that Walsh had claimed I lacked. I wasn't just going to present research, I was going to unveil a working system that solved real problems while advancing the state of engineering knowledge. During the months leading up to the symposium, word spread through the department about my project and its selection for the prestigious opening slot. Some faculty members who had been dismissive after Walsh's public criticism began showing interest in my work. Students who had avoided collaborating with me started asking questions about my research and expressing admiration for my grant funding success. Walsh's reaction to my symposium selection was predictable but satisfying. He made comments about how presentation selection sometimes prioritized flashy practical applications over rigorous academic work. He suggested that industry audiences were often impressed by demonstrations that lacked theoretical depth. Most telling, he questioned whether first-year graduate students were ready for the kind of exposure that symposium presentations provided. But his concerns were overruled by the department leadership, who recognized that my project represented exactly the kind of high-impact research that enhanced the university's reputation and attracted additional funding opportunities. They wanted to showcase work that combined academic excellence with practical relevance, and my microgrid project delivered both. As the symposium approached, I felt confident that my presentation would speak for itself. I'd spent months refining not just the technical content but also the educational aspects of my work. I wanted to demonstrate that practical experience could enhance rather than compromise academic rigor, and that real-world problem-solving required exactly the kind of systematic analysis that Walsh claimed to value. The day of the symposium arrived with perfect weather and an impressive attendance of nearly 300 participants, including representatives from major renewable energy companies, Department of Energy officials, and faculty from universities across the region. The opening presentation was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main auditorium, with the entire symposium audience present. As I set up my presentation materials and prepared my prototype demonstration, I could see Walsh in the audience, sitting with other faculty members and looking skeptical about what he was about to witness. He had no idea that the student he'd publicly humiliated 6 months earlier was about to deliver the kind of presentation that would establish a reputation and launch a career. My presentation began with a clear problem statement about the challenges of providing reliable electricity for disaster relief and remote community development. I explained how existing solutions were either too expensive, too complex, or too unreliable for rapid deployment in challenging environments. Then I presented my solution, a modular microgrid system that could be transported in standard shipping containers, assembled by non-specialists in under 4 hours, and configured for different power requirements and environmental conditions. The system incorporated advanced power electronics, intelligent control algorithms, and robust energy storage, all designed using the rigorous engineering analysis that Walsh claimed I couldn't perform. But the real impact came when I demonstrated the working prototype I brought to the symposium. The system powered the auditorium's lighting and sound equipment while I explained its technical specifications, performance characteristics, and economic advantages over alternative approaches. The audience could see that this wasn't just theoretical research, it was a functioning solution to important real-world problems. I concluded my presentation by discussing the field testing partnerships I'd established and the deployment plans for disaster relief applications. I showed videos from recent testing where my system had successfully provided emergency power for a humanitarian organization's relief operations, demonstrating measurable impact beyond academic publications. The response was overwhelming. The audience gave me a standing ovation, and the question and answer session lasted nearly 30 minutes as industry representatives, government officials, and fellow researchers asked detailed technical questions and expressed interest in collaboration opportunities. During the networking session that followed, I was approached by representatives from 3 major renewable energy companies interested in licensing my technology, 2 Department of Energy program managers discussing expanded funding opportunities, and several university faculty members proposing research collaborations. But the most satisfying moment came when Walsh approached me after most of the crowd had dispersed. His expression was a mixture of surprise, grudging respect, and what looked like embarrassment as he realized that the student he'd dismissed as inadequately prepared had just delivered the most impressive presentation of his academic career. He congratulated me on my success and made some generic comments about being glad to see that I'd found my direction in graduate school. He avoided any reference to his previous assessment of my capabilities or acknowledgement of how wrong he'd been about my potential. I thanked him politely but didn't engage in extended conversation. There was nothing more to say. My work had spoken louder than any words could, and his assessment of my abilities had been publicly and decisively contradicted by the enthusiastic response from experts who actually understood the value of combining practical experience with rigorous analysis. That presentation established my reputation in the renewable energy field and opened doors that would define my career trajectory for years to come. The immediate aftermath of the symposium was transformative beyond anything I could have anticipated. Within days of my presentation, I received formal offers from 2 major renewable energy companies for summer internships that would accelerate my career development significantly. More importantly, 3 different universities reached out about potential PhD opportunities with full funding and research assistantships focused on expanding my microgrid work. But the most satisfying development was watching how my success changed the dynamics within my own department. Faculty members who had been cool or dismissive after Walsh's public criticism of my capabilities suddenly wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities. Students who had avoided working with me began asking for advice about grant applications and industry connections. The department chair called me into her office 2 weeks after the symposium to discuss my future plans and the university's interest in supporting my continued research. She mentioned that my work was attracting positive attention from donors and industry partners who were considering increased support for the renewable energy program. During that conversation, she also revealed something that confirmed what I'd suspected about Walsh's motivations. She explained that Walsh had been under pressure from the administration to demonstrate more practical relevance in his research and to improve his success rate with grant applications. His criticism of my practical approach may have reflected his own frustration with funding agencies increasing emphasis on real-world impact over purely theoretical work. The irony was that my success was exactly what the department needed to enhance its reputation and attract the kind of support that would benefit all faculty members, including Walsh. By combining rigorous engineering analysis with practical problem-solving, I demonstrated the approach that modern research sponsors wanted to fund. 3 months after the symposium, I made a decision that would permanently alter my relationship with Walsh and the university. I accepted an offer to pursue my PhD at MIT with a prestigious fellowship that would fund my research on next-generation microgrid technologies. The opportunity would allow me to work with leading researchers while continuing to develop practical applications for my innovations. Before leaving, I was invited to present my work at the department's end-of-year research showcase, where faculty and students would review the accomplishments of the past academic year. This would be my final presentation as a student in Walsh's department, and I wanted to make it count. My presentation focused on the broader implications of my research and the importance of bridging the gap between academic engineering and real-world implementation. I discussed how my background in construction had informed my understanding of practical deployment challenges and how addressing those challenges had led to innovations that advanced the theoretical understanding of distributed energy systems. I explained that the most significant engineering breakthroughs often came from combining different perspectives and experiences rather than following traditional academic pathways. I suggested that departments and faculty who embrace diverse backgrounds and unconventional approaches would be better positioned to address the complex challenges facing modern engineering. Throughout my presentation, I maintained a professional and respectful tone, never directly criticizing Walsh or referencing the incident that had motivated my journey. But everyone in the audience understood the subtext. The student who had been publicly dismissed as inadequately prepared was now heading to one of the world's most prestigious engineering programs with research that had attracted national attention. After my presentation, Walsh approached me privately to discuss my transition to MIT. He seemed genuinely interested in my future plans and offered to provide recommendation letters or other support that might be helpful for my continued success. Most surprisingly, he acknowledged that my work had demonstrated the value of combining practical experience with academic rigor, and that he'd learned from observing my approach to engineering problems. He said he planned to incorporate more real-world applications into his own courses and research projects. I appreciated his acknowledgement, but I also recognized that his change in attitude reflected my demonstrated success rather than any fundamental shift in his perspective about non-traditional students. If my research had failed or my career prospects had been poor, I doubted he would have reconsidered his assessment of practical experience versus academic preparation. 6 months later, I was established at MIT and making rapid progress on advanced microgrid research that would eventually lead to multiple patents and a startup company focused on humanitarian technology applications. My work was being cited by researchers around the world, and my systems were being deployed by international relief organizations in disaster zones and remote communities. The company I eventually founded has generated millions in revenue while providing electricity access to underserved communities in 12 countries. We've been recognized with multiple innovation awards and have attracted investment from major venture capital firms interested in sustainable technology solutions. Most satisfying has been the opportunity to mentor other students with non-traditional backgrounds who face skepticism about their readiness for advanced engineering study. I've learned that the combination of practical experience and rigorous analysis often produces more innovative solutions than either approach alone. Looking back on Walsh's prediction that I'd never succeed in engineering careers requiring genuine technical expertise, I realize he was wrong about almost everything. My practical background wasn't a limitation to overcome, it was an advantage that enabled me to identify important problems and develop solutions that purely academic approaches might have missed. The walk out of his classroom that day wasn't a retreat or admission of defeat. It was the first step toward proving that success in engineering comes from solving real problems with rigorous methods, regardless of whether you learned those methods in traditional academic settings or through hands-on experience. Walsh's assessment of my capabilities became irrelevant the moment I decided to let my work speak for itself rather than trying to argue with his preconceptions. Sometimes the best response to academic prejudice isn't confrontation, it's demonstration that excellence can emerge from unexpected backgrounds and unconventional paths. The professor who said I'd never make it was ultimately right about one thing. I didn't make it in the way he expected. I made it in ways that exceeded his imagination and redefined what success could look like for students with determination, creativity, and the courage to prove doubters wrong through action rather than words.